somewhere in the state of Montana, we found a person, a cool person, and we asked this person to ask Tristan Palmgren a question. And then, of course, we forgot to play this question for Tristan Palmgren for the podcast, but he answered it anyway. So we're going to go ahead and play the question and roll credits.
3, 2, 1.
Hi, I'm Katrina Venters and I teach English, and I was wondering what inspired you to combine historical fiction going all the way back to medieval Europe with sci-fi into one novel.
Hi, I'm the entire Prince of Egypt soundtrack, only sped up and shifted into minor key. Kent.
And hello, I am the alternate history in which the emus won the war. Tony.
Ooh. I like that one. So hello and welcome to the cast today. We have yet another amazing, fantastic, much look forward to guest on the show today. We are going to be talking to Tristan Palmgren. If you want to go ahead and wave hello audibly on the cast.
I'm waving as loud as I can.
Love it. So Tristan writes fantastically unexpected books that throw rocks at genres as diverse as historical fiction, alternate history, anthropological science fiction, and then runs away either screaming or laughing, and I can't quite tell which yet.
The Unity I think crying is a good one.
Crying, okay.
Yes, runs away crying. That's my brand.
The Unity series consists of Quietus, which is the mashup of medieval psychoanalysis and bubonic plague history that you never knew was possible, but you definitely need in your life, and Terminus, a bender of a trip into a convulsing Europe and a flailing AI. They both came out in 2018, proving that Palmgren is both a high achiever and also possibly superhuman. So they're cool on Twitter. So Tristan, would you go ahead and just kind of tell us who you are, what brought you into writing in the first place, and did we miss anything?
No, those were the big things to show off. What brought me into writing is one of those things I wish I could explain. I've been writing since I was in middle school. I have no idea why. It was probably a mistake. It's too late to stop now. I can't really make myself. I've been producing far too many words and far too many novels that have gone unpublished up until this past year, when I had Quietus and Terminus come out from Angry Robot Books, both in 2018, Quietus in March and Terminus in November. It's been an amazing journey.
Yeah.
And an amazing read. As your readers, I can verify that they are bringing something totally new to all the genres that you could possibly examine. So
I think I was writing for so long that I mostly started writing those books for myself. So I am extremely happy that they got out there and that they're connecting with people. Thank you.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
For sure.
So we're going to talk about a lot of things on the podcast today. We're going to talk about time, capitalism, feudalism, science fantasy, and maybe end it by talking about how to do better. So
I'm sure we'll solve all those problems. Don't worry.
We're going to solve every problem.
In the next hour.
What the podcast is for.
Yes.
So Tony, do you want to go ahead and kind of lead us into that first the conversation about time?
Absolutely. So we're going to start really, really small, and we're going to talk about all of time.
Yes.
So time is weird. I'm just going to start there and say that, in fact, it's super weird. So where the place that we kind of want to start, we want to kind of lob out there that time is something that science fiction, and to a lesser extent fantasy, has played with for a long time. Going back to the days of H.G. Wells and the Time Machine. Time is kind of one of those playthings of science fiction. So what is so fun about time, and why do we like playing with time? What are some of the things that playing with time allows us to do in science fiction that we couldn't do anywhere else?
Mm-hmm. Oh, no pressure.
No pressure.
Just be super profound.
No.
Well, one of the reasons why I like writing in history is that it feels a lot like writing in an alien world. It helps us make the world, or the things that we know, unknown, and in some sense not just unknown, but unknowable. Writing in history or about history or changing history and alternate history can give you some of the same pleasure of like reading a really good nonfiction book, of learning things and educating yourself, but also feel like, picking up a science fiction book and diving into some place that is not really knowable or understandable or comprehensible. Some of the ways that history makes our world alien and unknowable is, first of all, it's very, depending on the period you're writing about, it can be very difficult to travel. Can't really predict major weather events. They could seem capricious or supernatural. And the human urge to find narratives could make them seem like directed and living. I think there's a reasonable comparison you could make between tornadoes as they were perceived in the medieval or pre-modern world to sandworms in the Doomed series.
Yeah. And I love that
just
comparison.
Kind of unknowable forces.
Yeah, right. Because you have this kind of larger than life moving, these things that are moving as though they are alive. In the case of the sandworms, we have the perspective to know that they are living. But to someone who doesn't have the same cultural cachet as we do, a tornado could absolutely look like something that is alive and has purpose and, is coming to get you, which is terrifying.
It absolutely looks alive. When I was in preschool, I thought that tornado in The Wizard of Oz was alive.
Yeah.
It was one of the reasons why it was so scary.
So one of the things that I've been fascinated to kind of plug back into, because I've been reading Terminus much more recently than I read Quietus, is that in your work you layer the awareness of those things. So you'll have characters who don't they can't predict weather patterns, for example, but then you have characters who have the technology that can predict weather patterns, observing the characters who can't predict weather patterns. And that's just a very micro example, but this is happening, all throughout both of your books, this sort of layering of knowledge and who has access to it and what that knowledge allows the characters to do and feel about their circumstances. And yeah, so I guess I'm curious about what knowledge about time does to someone's sense of agency.
No, that was very intentional. One of the the genesis of the first book, Quietus, was in just reading a book about the Black Death and trying to figure out how to divorce my perspective. Knowing everything that I do about the bubonic plague and the future course of human history from what the people who lived through that time were experiencing. And I came to the conclusion that I couldn't. And a lot of what Quietus is, with the interdimensional anthropologists that come to visit the Earth and study the Black Death, is about that relationship, if I can sound really pretentious for a moment, between the reader and the read. The anthropologists are the readers, and the read are the people who are actually living in that time, or Nicoluccio and all of his doomed friends.
Well, and it's an interesting thing to kind of revisit now because, up until recent times, I don't think the Black Death was a regular instrument of science fiction or science fantasy. It's something that maybe even most of us didn't know about, but all of a sudden there's a slew of nonfiction books coming out. There was Black Death at the Golden Gate by David Randall that just came out this month or last month. And so suddenly a lot of readers, specifically Western readers, are coming to a new understanding of this one particular tool that you put in your toolkit. And I wonder if that's going to kind of affect their understanding of history, of their ability to kind of crack open what it was you were trying to do with your depiction of history. And have you seen this? Have you seen this new surge of bubonic plague literature that's kind of coming in?
No, I have not. I wish I'd read it. I've read a lot about the Black Death when I was doing research for the novel, but nothing especially recently. The genesis for that book came from a book by Barbara Tuchman. She's a wonderful historian, a novelist historian. Just the language and the depth and the meaning with which she kind of draws its scenes. It's called The Distant Mirror, the Calamitous 14th Century, and it did not dwell on the Black Death all that often. In fact, the character that it focuses on postdates the Black Death, so there's only really a chapter or two. But it's drawn very, very thoroughly and very poignantly.
Well, it is now officially in my Goodreads to read list, so thank you for continuing to keep our public library busy. So that's like kind of a basic intro to time. Tony, do you want to kind of tease out some of those other questions that you're trying to get at?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the reasons that your books stood out to me when I first read them is that you have this movement through time. Like, time is suddenly as traversable as space has traditionally been in a lot of other science fiction. And I wonder, you know, if you're thinking about time again, and maybe, you know, riffing again on the ways that history and playing with history can make the known kind of alien and unknown or unknowable. You know, what other things were you playing with? Like, what other aspects of time were really working for you?
Well, like I said, a lot of Quietus came from the gosh, how to phrase this. A lot of what I was writing about was that relationship between the reader and the read, or the reader of history and the people being read in history.
Right.
And for everything that I just said earlier about, you know, the history seeming like an unknown and unknowable world, to some extent, if you're living in it, to us, it's really not. We can't really divorce our perspectives and everything we know about the years to come, like what the bubonic plague actually was, from ourselves when we're reading that.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that the characters in any historical setting are just as uncertain about our future, about their future, as we are of ours. But that can be tricky to capture because we can't remove that perspective and that background knowledge. Like, we know, and we can't make ourselves not know, that the world continued on after the Black Death.
Right.
But for many of the people who lived through it, the Black Death, or the Great Mortality, was plausibly the end of the world, and knowing that shaped their actions.
Yeah.
It's really very difficult to make ourselves as readers believe that that could happen, because we're always at a remove from those characters.
Right.
Like, even if you haven't really read like a great deal about the Black Death or that era, you have a broad sense of the next several centuries of history. And knowing that can do something even worse. It can be easy to think of people who, from what we in the future know, have factually incorrect ideas as naive or as idiots, even if they had perfectly reasonable for them reasons of thinking about the way they did.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons why fantasy and science fiction and alternate history are so appealing to me, is that we get to go out of the present day, but still somewhere where the future is unknown and seems unknowable. And without spoiling too much about Quietus, the anthropologists who visit this monastery during the Black Death think they know what's going on and what's going to happen, but they are very, very wrong, and that perspective is shorn from them and hopefully shorn from the reader very quickly, so that hopefully we can experience some of the feeling of what those people actually living through that time experienced.
And what's resonating with me as you're saying a lot of this is that sort of recognition of living in history, of being at sort of a place at which future seems uncertain and, you know, not up for, I don't know, you know, where everything seems a little uncertain. So I'm thinking specifically of our current political climate, especially post 2016 presidential election. And, you know, I don't mean to compare that directly to the plague in Europe. However, there's certainly, like, you know, there's certainly, for me at least, this sense of being in history, of being uncertain a lot of the time. Whereas, you know, partially because I was younger, partially because I don't think there was the same degree of uncertainty due to political pressure, to climate change, to political response or non-response to climate change, etc. So I'm like totally picking up what you're saying, and it's so interesting to sort of like have that in many hundreds of years in the past for your characters.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious too. So when I think about like writing backwards in time,
Mhm.
I'm reminded of what I've heard many times on, science podcasts or in the scientific literature about the way in which memory works, which is that every time you remember an event, you're encoding it with the feelings of the current remembering moment, essentially. So every time you remember something, you are remembering it differently. You're never truly remembering the original event except for the first time that you recall it.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go back and we write history, when you go back and write history, how much are you kind of encoding the present on the past? And what do you see your responsibility as a writer and a researcher and an enthusiast of medieval history to like some sort of airy fairy, I'm doing big loosey goosey finger movements here, but like fidelity of the original events, like as we know them. And so I guess I'm just curious, like what do you think that your role is in that?
Well, first of all, I don't know if the last perspective or the last Imaginaries podcast I listened to is the last one that's going to be out before this one, but it was your conversation with Sarah Gailey.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to say I love that, and that is going to inform a lot of what I'm going to say right now.
Yeah.
If people listening to this haven't already listened to that, listen to it. It was wonderful. I enjoyed that very much.
Yay. That is going to be the last one before yours. Yes.
History is filled with things that are actually unknowable, things that weren't recorded, or things that were recorded incorrectly, or narratives that are overwritten by the people writing history, or narratives that were overwritten by not even people that were writing history, but people that are teaching history.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there is any way for any writer writing in history to capture everything that I think we would need to capture,
Mm-hmm.
even knowable recorded history, to do the people who lived there justice. And this may seem kind of pessimistic and depressing, but I think at some point we just have to accept that if we want to write about history.
Yeah.
I will try my best to get the knowledge, to get everything that I can correct, but I'm always trying to be aware of just how much my own perspective has been shaped by people writing those narratives. What narratives might have been left out, what might have not been recorded, for what reason, and doing my best to write around that. But I don't think there is any way to perfectly do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I try to do a lot, and this may be a little bit of a cheat, but a helpful one, is to find blanks between the facts that were recorded and the narratives were written, and fill them in plausibly.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine what people living in those blanks might have said and felt.
And you do so by allowing your interplanar anthropologists to observe them doing the recording of history, doing the enacting of history, using their own sort of recording devices. It's a very interesting sort of, layer within a layer.
I just wanted to and to impose their own narratives on the people they're observing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a really interesting moment in Terminus where one character essentially offers back another person's sense of agency. Like there's a little, gimmick there where like she's giving a thing that will sort of return agency to this character. But in so doing, this character is forced to kind of examine motives and also like the question of consent, which I thought was really meaningful and kind of difficult to tease apart.
Or even in pulling back the veil, someone is trying to impose their narrative on another person. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you just can't get away from it. And I thought that was brilliant. And so Terminus in a lot of ways is even more upfront about like the difficulty of parsing, what is me and what is you and what is mediated and what's, etc. So it goes on in a brilliant fashion. So that there's a lot of, I'm just going to kind of do a very awkward segue here because I'm great at those. So.
There's a lot of...
Segue theme.
We're going to talk about feudalism next. And feudalism is something that, you know, for the most part, when you're looking at science fiction and fantasy, really only a kind of time travel makes possible. Like, there's this myth, at least, that feudalism isn't something that's like a current, present, ongoing concern. And that if we're going to talk about feudalism, we need to, you know, go back to medieval Europe or some medieval light, sort of Western inflected world. I'm thinking here of like Game of Thrones, etc. So Tony, you know, you want to kind of lead us deeper into this feudalism conversation and save me from my segue?
Yes, absolutely. Let me save you from the segue with the segue sound. Do. Okay. So we actually will have another episode coming out next time in which we talk to Kim Stanley Robinson, and he will say something in that podcast. This is a bit of a spoiler, but that stuck with me because we record all out of order. But he said that a lot of fantasy dwells in this pre-capitalism place, that science fiction kind of takes on capitalism where it is or what it could be or what could replace it, but a lot of fantasy dwells prior to capitalism. And this was part of, we were talking more largely about capitalism, but I think it's an interesting kind of frame to bring to this, because we are talking about something different. We're talking about, you know, a system of governance, a system of social, I don't want to say control, but control that existed, that actually existed. So what is it about feudalism, especially when we have, and your books are obviously kind of an exception to this because you're writing historical science fiction, but especially when we're looking at more fantastical works, you know, what is the draw of feudalism?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm extremely intimidated that my episodes are coming out, or my episode is coming out between Sarah Gailey and Kim Stanley Robinson. Especially since I fear I'm afraid I'm going to bring the discourse down a level and start talking about the mechanics of storytelling rather than big, heady ideas, at least for a moment.
But mechanics are how you get to big, heady ideas, so they're important to talk about too.
Yeah.
And they influence them and they play back and forth.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, feudalism is appealing for fiction because it's a very personal mode of governance and maps itself onto single characters and capital letters dramatic moments. From a writer's perspective, it's easier to write and understand like a prince than it is a senate with hundreds of people in it. Because a prince is a character, and a senate or a ruling council or like some other complicated body is much harder to wrap your head around, much less write a scene around, and trying to deal with that can bog down storytelling. I mean, you could also argue why this is why it's easier to write about any system that concentrates power in individuals. Is this lazy? Sure is. I can see the appeal in it, though. Certainly when the same feudal structures occur in novel after novel in places where it seems like it should have no business being. Like there are a lot of like science fiction empires modeled on feudalism for some reason. Yeah. But like a lot of tropes, it's a shortcut. A reader has an immediate understanding of what a baron of a star system might be, as opposed to an invented title with different responsibilities, or more than that, a whole body of people with invented names. Yeah. It's just easier to grasp something that you can immediately see as a character.
Yeah.
Having a baron also allows you to ascribe a personality to a person. These are all things that you want to do in stories, and with by mapping these tropes onto them, you've done them in the space of a few words. From an efficiency of storytelling perspective, in genres that struggle with going on for too many words, this can be incredibly appealing. If you, as a writer, are trying to focus your reader's attention on a handful of characters on the periphery of that system, of like a star system, using feudal tropes as shortcuts can shorten your info dump sections.
So in a sense, is this saying that if you see a feudal expression or structure in a book, you probably need to be looking elsewhere for the author's main going concern, like the main work that they're trying to do?
Well, hopefully. I mean, there are stories where the feudal structure of space empires is the whole point. I'm thinking largely, again, of Dune.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of times they're used as shortcuts, like feudal systems as they appear in Star Wars. Star Wars is not going to go into great detail about the system of governments on most worlds most of the time, but there are still people who are counts for some reason.
Yeah.
Yes. In the middle of a Senate system, which is confusing. Yeah, and it kind of makes me wonder when I think about the ways in which systems of governance crop up in Star Wars. It's very disorganized, and yet at the same time, when they tried to be super intentional about it, like when they introduced the Galactic Senate in the prequel trilogy, and Padme is attending her senatorial meetings and whatnot, it caused a lot of people to yawn. And I guess I'm curious if part of that yawn comes from the disorganizedness of it, or if it comes from just trying to depict something as complicated and nuanced as like a Senate on the big screen while you're also trying to do like exciting chases and, insects that can kill you in your sleep and things like that.
Right, like try to apply a personality to the Galactic Imperial Senate from the prequels, as opposed to somebody like Grand Moff Tarkin from the original movies, or Emperor Palpatine. It's much easier to grasp the former than the latter.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this doesn't mean that the prequels didn't have other problems or couldn't have done it better, but that might be a different conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So feudalism is, if it's a shortcut, then, what does kind of working our way around feudalism or going at feudalism and trying to do something different with it, what does that allow us to do? Like, what surprises are left in the realm of feudalism for a science fiction or fantasy writer?
That is a tricky question to answer, because I personally don't see that there are many surprises from what I can see sitting here. But I'm just one storyteller, and I don't want to say that there aren't the 1,000 or 1 million more out there who could do something surprising with it. I mean, if I could predict them, then they wouldn't be surprising.
It wouldn't be a surprise, right?
But they're not what I would personally do, because using feudalism as these kind of tropes and shortcut can do some harm. Like feudalism, is almost always presented as Western feudalism.
Right.
And that erases broad swaths of history and people and possibility. And it's almost always presented as Western feudalism because it's almost always aimed at a Western audience who are more familiar with those tropes, and so that shorthand functions more efficiently.
Yeah.
But feudalism is also an inherently conservative perspective, etched intentionally or not into a story's world building.
Mm-hmm.
And also just accumulates a set of encrusted tropes that just get boring and stale over time.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to noodle around about what we can do to get past this, or what other tropes can serve that same useful shortcut for world building. And one thing I like to do is try to make my systems of governments unknowable and not understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Like to have complicated systems of governments exist on the fringes of the story and deliberately make them mysterious and unknowable. I mean, it is unlikely, after all, that we would be able to comprehend governance and the structures of power 500 years from now, let alone 5,000, any more than like a medieval farmer could have understood modern corporate capitalism or high frequency trading.
Right.
I mean, frankly, I don't understand them, and I live in this time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, not the systems of power and finance making themselves not easily comprehensible is part of the point,
right,
and part of the way that power is exercised.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe getting a little off track there. But if you make the world seem larger and more mysterious, and use terms that audiences don't recognize, if you don't dwell on them, and if they're not important to the story, you do make your world seem larger and more mysterious. And there are even broadly popular science fiction series that get away with this. Mm-hmm. The one that comes first to mind is Star Trek.
Yeah,
it comes up a lot of times that the Federation doesn't really use money.
Right.
But people on Earth still work. They still enjoy doing what they're doing. They all have different goals.
Yes.
How does this work? Who cares? The series never gets into it, and it doesn't need to get into it. I don't want to get into it.
Yeah.
It's likely that if they ever did try to seriously explore that, it would be it seems to me like the world of Star Trek, if it should not actually be very readily comprehensible to us poor 21st century peasants. It should be unknowable.
Yeah.
And none of the stories require that they get into it, and so they don't. And I am perfectly content with that, and I am very pleased that they have not really delved into that.
Yeah.
Well, you said Tony's magic words, so Star Trek.
They were Star Trek. They were Star Trek, yes. And I just, I agree with everything you just said. And one of the ways, and that's one of the major ways that I think Star Trek both succeeds and does not succeed, which is kind of pretending that, you're in this wonderful post-scarcity utopia, and yet people still choose to work. And it's great that there's sort of this idea that people are bettering themselves, people are in pursuit of knowledge. Granted, we see most of the Federation, we see most of Star Trek's universe through the eyes of Starfleet, so we're definitely biased. But as I often do, compare it then to the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, and think about how even how the culture works is more of a black box than the Federation, because it's all done by machine, because the minds are completely unfathomable and take care of everything and everyone.
And most of the humans are kept around as pets.
Exactly. Yep. So
I think we got a glimpse what was in Player of Games into what a lot of just average Federation, average culture citizens do with their times. There were a lot of MMOs.
Yep.
And RPGs.
Yes, exactly.
Which totally jives with our modern understanding of a, post-scarcity society, which we're not quite there yet. But, what do people do when they don't have immediate demands on their survival? Well, they do a lot of gaming, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So another segue here.
Segue theme.
Yeah.
You do need to edit in a segue theme.
Oh my God, we should absolutely have a segue theme.
Segue.
Oh my God, the remix.
Like a raptor. But yeah, so we've been talking about big systems of governance, which kind of brings us to, I guess, one of the outputs of big systems of governance, at least as we've experienced it here, in the West and just on planet Earth in general. It's hard to escape from the thing that is colonialism, either as a member, an inheritor of the colonizing power, or as someone who inherits or directly experiences the negative effects of colonization on other, people groups and whatnot. So colonialism is something that it really, really sucks. And this is something that a lot of science fiction and fantasy authors, they're eager to kind of dig into in their work. So right now we're seeing a lot of different social experiments in science fiction, trying to find and tinker with the underpinnings of society so that we can get away from it. We've got people who are just full on kind of confronting, its effects. And then we've got people who are kind of tackling it as through the process of grief. How do you navigate colonialism? And I guess I'm just curious, what kinds of unanswered questions about social responsibility and ethics can science fiction and fantasy, let us tuck into that maybe the other genres, the popular genres, I'm doing again big, fingers and air quotes and whatnot, that they can't, what can science fiction and fantasy do that crime fiction or et cetera can't, or are these distinctions useless between genres?
Well, this is a really, really tricky, deep, and core issue for science fiction, because a lot of science fiction is based on essentially colonialist fantasy, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The idea of going out into the universe and settling unknown star systems and creating vast interstellar empires. A core underspoken part of more SF settings than I can name is colonization. Star Trek settles innumerable star systems. Yeah. There are any number of books that settle Mars and the Jovian moons. And a key understated premise in most of these is that these worlds were uninhabited before the characters, the people who are settling them, arrive. So when I was a wee little baby SF writer, that surface level fact was the only one I paid much attention to. Well, because these worlds are explicitly stated to be uninhabited, then this doesn't fit into patterns of colonial genocide and indigenous erasure. I mean, if you say that a world is empty, well, then it's empty. And with real settings like Mars, we can see with our own eyes and instruments that it's also empty. So why not, making big air quotes you'll have to imagine, colonize it? I mean, there's nobody there to be harmed, right? That's the most surface level question, and it leaves a lot unsaid and unexplored. Most significantly, the literary tradition of colonialist narratives and the way that a lot of science fiction settings are built off those tropes and haven't really questioned them. The literary tradition of colonialist narratives is not only important to SF stories about colonizing other worlds, it was foundational. And key to that tradition is erasure. It was pretending that the lands being settled were never inhabited or were sparsely inhabited. It was ignoring the deliberate genocides. It was creating fantasy worlds of pristine, open, uninhabited lands ready for farming or mining or other exploitation. And those narratives really do commit violence by that omission.
Well, and that seems like a particularly American thing, too, like North American at least. Like I think of the American fantasy of the empty West and how it was just waiting for, farmers to come and farm the land and manifest their destinies. My great-great-grandfolks, were enticed west in Canada with the exact same language. Like, this is empty land, and it is just waiting for a good farmer to come and make something of it. When, of course, we know that that's not true. And we, on some level, have always known that that's not true, but we have collectively had this fantasy and enforced this fantasy so that we would, I guess, feel less guilty about being there on the land.
Just so that we could self-justify it and rationalize it to ourselves. This goes back again to your conversation with Sarah Gailey last week, and their take on alternate history, in that a lot of the narratives we have been fed are alternate history, and that the idea that this literary trope that a lot of science fiction, including series I love, is based on that alternate history and that erasure.
The only histories we have are alternate, essentially.
Yeah.
Oh, deep sigh. Okay, so to get you back on track, Lynn, talking about science fiction and fantasy and the toolkit and what colonialism and colonialist narratives do, what do you think that this colonialism in science fiction and fantasy can bring in terms of assumptions? Like, can we break assumptions about colonialism? Is that a possibility even?
So there are a lot of rationalizations for colonization in science fiction. Probably the one I've seen most often is safety from extinction level events. If a giant comet hits Earth, at least the human race will survive. If you have somebody on Mars, theoretically, then we probably won't be very happy or alive for very long, but that's beside the point. Other justifications that I see a lot are having a population release valve. There's just too many darn people on Earth, and we've got to ship them off to the off-world colonies.
Totally affordable.
or you have political exoduses, people going somewhere just to be away from other people and their governments or their power. And then there's also the classic exploitation of resources, mining the asteroid belt, mining the moon, and so on. And all of these, they've started to read for me more like excuses for a setting than justification. So let's go through some of those, starting with exploitation of resources. Whatever we're getting out there had better be exceptionally good to justify the cost of going outside of Earth's gravity well to retrieve it. There's not very much that is.
Is there anything? I can't think of anything at this point. I mean, people have speculated about helium-3 on the moon, and that's an integral part of like Ian McDonald's Luna series, which is like a great series, but it still feels like that's not the main point of the narrative. The main point of the narrative is to get all these people in the same place and that you can explore the relationships between them. And helium-3 is just kind of like a way to make that happen.
Yes, it's the rationalization for the story. It's something that if Lunar Helium-3 did not exist, then something else for the story's sake would have to exist to bring it all together. But diverging a bit into Lunar Helium-3, way back in the ancient live journal days of a decade ago, this was one of James D. Nichols's hobby horses. That Lunar Helium-3 would actually be cheaper fuel-wise to retrieve from the sun than from the moon, if you even wanted to collect it in the first place, which, given that it's would theoretically be used in a type of fusion that hasn't been proved could even work, well, that would be another barrier to cross. So we really start to get to the point where people are starting to like. It seems like people are looking for excuses rather than reasons to go out there.
Yeah.
It's, others, like there's political exodus, given the extreme inhospitability of extraterrestrial environments and the strict controls of transportation that would be necessary to reach it. Human outposts on other worlds are probably going to be a little more politically dependent on home powers than anyone else on Earth right now. So I have a little trouble imagining that.
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, that holds up when you think back because I mostly know like British and American history, it holds up with your colonies, your religious exclusionary colonies that fled to the New World.
It's basically mapping a historical narrative onto science fiction again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I say, it's another kind of fantasy there, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's also talk about being safe from extinction level events. To some extent, this is fair enough, given that there are many extinction events that humans can't control, like the big comet that comes to hit us. But there are many more extinction level events that we can, and that we could forestall with a fraction of the resources that it would take to inhabit a world like Mars. And even worse, there are several extinction level events that we are causing right now, like climate change. If the goal is to avoid extinction, the resources we would put into colonization seem more appropriately put into stabilizing and sustaining our own world.
We're doing such a great job.
Yes, we're wonderful. On a related for getting to that last justification, colonization as a population release valve implies an ever-expanding, increasingly uncontrollable population, which is an idea that comes with its own problems. But more importantly, I think the last thing people have ever historically wanted to do is spend an immense amount of resources on population they don't want. That does not seem very likely.
It also seems like there are, and historically have been, much more brutal ways of dealing with that problem than shipping them off-world or shipping them overseas.
We supposedly are being told that we can't deal with 1 million refugees right now. What do you think these people would be enthusiastic about doing with 1 billion refugees? I just had one other point I wanted to make. That was, a point borrowed from Charlie Strauss. In 2007, he said something that's really stuck with me over the years, which is that there's far more reason to build homes and cities in the Antarctic or under the ocean than there are to build cities in places like Mars or the Moon. There are great swaths of uninhabited land still here. And as inhospitable as the Marianas Trench is, it's far more hospitable compared to Mars. There's abundant food and water, again, certainly compared to Mars. It's far easier to reach, won't expose travelers to cosmic radiation and solar storms that will certainly, at the very least, lower their lifespans. And it's also easier for trade. It's easier for new resources to come in and easier to protect in emergencies.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, and speaking of Kim Stanley Robinson again, he also published a book, Antarctica, based on his research. And this is not his most current work, but it still, I think, provides us with a lot of interesting ethical questions about sort of tackling this land that is supposedly or theoretically uninhabited. And so the entire book is this one long question about, how far do we go? How far is ethical? And, what role do ethics have to play when the people who are now making the decisions are the ones who have historically been shafted by people in power structures? So, like, what's more ethical, letting the disempowered, stake claim to this land, or letting the possibly problematically empowered continue to control, population pressure issues on the planet?
I think you wrote a similar one. I don't think it was a full novel, more a novella that was an alternate universe retelling of the Red Mars series, also set in Antarctica, where instead of the Martians going to Mars in that book, they went to Antarctica. Great pairing with what we're talking about. I wish I could remember the name of the novella.
We'll get it and we'll stick it in the show notes. So we'll make sure that the dots get connected there. Tony, did you have any sort of closing questions when it comes to colonialism in science fiction and fantasy?
Okay, so we have colonialism, right? Which is like putting people in places where they have not been historically, where they are taking land, they're interrupting ecosystems, they're extracting resources, they are, at the very least disrupting the people who live there. At the worst, they're displacing them, they're killing them. There's a lot that could be going on there. So all of that kind of implies that people are going to a place and settling and using and taking. Is that kind of, are we saying that that the exploration narrative is kind of also the colonialism narrative, or are there other ways to sort of present relationships between people as they're moving around?
Well, I don't think that that exploration and study by itself is colonialist. At least that is my initial thought. I'm certainly open to argument, but that's something I would love to see more of in other settings: is people going to places just to learn about them, not to study them. I think the anthropologists of Quietus are going to this place, they think, to explore and to study and to just learn intangible things that they can take back with them, rather than to leave their own mark or on the land that they're visiting, or on the land or on the people that they're visiting.
So you'd written in the show notes that you're interested in like the effects of contact rather than colonization. In your, when you said that, how did you define contact, and how is contact different from colonization?
Well, contact is in my mind, and these are unformed thoughts, as just going to somewhere, either openly. Well, let me backtrack on that. It would just be going to either, not even necessarily just going to somewhere, maybe even just studying somewhere from afar for the sake of learning about it. Just collecting data without leaving more of a mark than is absolutely necessary. Or even if, you're studying a place from afar with a telescope, with just collecting photons, right, and learning about a place that way. Yeah. I get, I'm totally on board with that, and it just seems like, a lot of, I don't know. I always, as stated in literally probably every episode we've done, I default to Star Trek a lot when I'm thinking about it. And it's just like, so much of Star Trek's mission is, again, utopian, very positive. Like, it is exploration, it is the pursuit of knowledge. But I just wonder, how much of, kind of unexamined exploration or unexamined knowledge seeking is, comes from a colonial place, comes from a colonial history, and what happens after the Enterprise stops at this planet? Is it ripe for colonization? What kind of colony goes there? I don't even know if this is
all of this it's very complicated. I'm not coming to a question, but it's something that I think is definitely, given the past, both for science fiction and where science fiction came from, is an important thing to think about.
You can get me talking about Star Trek for hours and hours too.
Yes.
In particular, it does try to present like a very positive spin on common colonialist narratives. I'm thinking of The Devil in the Dark, the original Star Trek episode with the Horta, the big moving carpet that melts through things. At the end, spoilers for a 50-year-old plus television episode. The end of the series, the miners on that world and the alien Horta decide that they will work better together than apart. That there's no need for either of them to kill each other, and that the Horta can actually be put to work aiding the miners. And then the Horta gets I don't know what out of this particular relationship, maybe not being killed anymore, but it's presented very positively.
Yeah.
And I'm curious too. So, like, you mentioned Contact, and of course my brain flashes to like the Carl Sagan novel and the film that was inspired by it. And for a moment I was thinking, oh, well, Contact presents like a kind of utopian grand vision for exploring the universe without, leaving too many heavy fingerprints on it. And of course, then in the film adaptation, you have observers who are kind of monitoring human development, and they're kind of being very hands off. Like once humans get to a certain stage, then we'll, talk to you a little bit more, engage with your culture a little bit more. And for a moment, I was thinking of that as kind of like the binary or the opposite of the colonialist narrative. But then I was thinking, well, except Carl Sagan and all of us who live in this country that has birthed so many of our great, astronomers and science communicators, we are completely affected by colonialism. It's like a ground level foundational building block to our understanding of who we are and how we do this thing that is called exploration. So I don't know that you can get away from it, even when you're trying to build this grand utopian vision for exploration like Sagan was.
Well, Contact is a wonderful example. And I may springboard off in a slightly different direction. So
go for it.
That story focuses on something I'd love to see in more science fiction, which is the effects of contact rather than of colonization.
Yeah.
Like the ways in which the world that is contacted in Contact. Gosh, I'm blanking on the star. It was only repeated about 200 different times in the novel and the movie. Vega, thank you. The way that the only way that the Vegans affected us was by sending us a message that if we wanted, we could have ignored entirely, but that completely changed civilization on Earth. Now, do you think that changed civilization in a colonial way? Where in that novel or in that film, were we in some ways being colonized by this message that we received that shaped us in ways that, at least it does not seem like the Vegans could have anticipated?
Well, they had to know that their message would, if people listened to it, which, that's kind of a false binary there, people not listening or people listening. Like there's going to be some people who will and some people who won't. And it's entirely up to how influential the ones are who do listen in terms of how much it affects society from the top down. But they had to know that there would be some sort of response. And in planting that seed, at the very least, they colonized our sense of self and our sense of place in the universe and altered forever how I'm saying we as if I'm living in the movie because I'm still there. Our sense of value as either, loners in the universe or like one among many in the universe. So I think that they colonized something, but whether you're talking about a traditional colonization process, that is up in the air for me. What do you think, Tony?
I have never thought about it in those terms before, and that's such an interesting thought experiment because my immediate thought is maybe it is, but if it is, like, I want them to do it. I want to be colonized because, like, the better scenario in that case is that they reach out and talk to us rather than leaving us alone. And it seems to me, reading into the book, reading into the movie, like, the very first signal that they receive is kind of a bounce back of the first televised signal of the Olympics in Germany in the 30s. And there it's almost kind of like a recognition of a peer or an equal. Like, you've reached this technological level. We are also of a similar technological level. Let's be friends or something, like, and it's less colonialist in that way to my mind. But in the same way, like, I absolutely think an argument could be made that it's, there is at least colonialism of thought, of personhood, of identity, like Ken said, going on there. And that is just, I don't know, I've never thought, it's blowing my mind a little bit, and I love it because I love Contact so much, and like having a new way to think about it is amazing.
The Vatican sure didn't treat Ellie like an equal when she actually got to wherever they were.
No, not at all.
They invaded her mind. They just introduced themselves and then said that everything else will absolutely be happening on their terms.
Yep.
This is putting a much darker spin on that.
But I mean, there's some narratives where you get like outsiders coming in, or I'm saying outsiders, I mean like aliens essentially colonizing Earth, and the effects are not so good. Either they have deliberate negative effects on the planet, or they have like unintentional negative effects. I'm thinking here of like the Strigozzi brothers' Roadside Picnic, where it's like they didn't really even notice that we were here, but their trash essentially is really messing with all of our physics and all of our like planetary laws. And then, you have something more like, what was that novella that you read last year, Tony, that had...
Are you thinking of
The Artist?
Landscape with Invisible Hand?
Yes, and Landscape with Invisible Hand, where like they really, I mean, they seem to have like some ideas of shaping human culture. They seem to care sort of, but not really all that much. I don't know, what was your read on that, Tony?
I definitely, like, I loved that novella. It was one of our favorites of, it was either last year or 2017, I can't remember now, but by M.T. Anderson, which is definitely worth checking out. But essentially it's like kind of alien colonization and exploitation of people of Earth for the random shit that they do. Like, sometimes it's art, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's, I don't know. It's basically, like, the book itself is kind of a commentary on what's going on now in terms of hyperinflation, in terms of the loss of job availability, things like that. But it is definitely, it is straight up the aliens colonized Earth, and we get to see the really shitty effects of that on humanity.
Yeah, I'm reading Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy.
Yes.
Is this your first time?
Very similar vibes. This is a very alien kind of colonization, but the word colonized is used very deliberately and specifically several times.
Yes.
I don't want to spoil it too much, and I haven't gotten to the end, so I can't spoil too much. But what it seems like is happening is that absolutely everything about a person, about a person who has contact with this alien thing is being stolen or changed or warped or colonized away from underneath them. Even things that they didn't imagine could be changed.
Yes. One of my favorite lines from Area X is from early on in Annihilation, when the biologist says something like, desolation colonizes you from the inside. And I just, like, that is a mic drop line for me. Like, it's so good.
That whole series is a mic drop. By the time I walked out, I had been colonized by the book and by the alienation of self from like preconceived notions of what makes us us. I think that was, just a brilliant move. So again, you've stumbled on like magic words for us. We could talk about Area X.
I am dying. I am about 20% away from the end of the last book.
Yes.
Oh, and we're keeping you from it. Yes. Okay, we're going to torment you a little longer, if that's okay.
Of course.
Great. Okay. So the last kind of like subject mattery thing that was on our list of topics we really wanted to talk with you about on today's podcast was science fantasy. So Tony, did you want to go ahead and kind of like bring us into that conversation?
Yes, absolutely. So I said at the top of the episode that time travel is one of those things that is historically associated with science fiction for good or for ill. We're not saying anything about that now, just saying that it is, again, courtesy of like H.G. Wells and the Time Machine. But we have a lot of association, I think, with the Middle Ages, with feudalism, with particular settings, with particular landscapes. When we see medieval, we think fantasy. So all those things I just said, with the exception of time travel, tend to sort of resonate as part of fantastical works and not so much as science fictional works. That said, I think that you have obvious exceptions to that. Connie Willis's Oxford Time Traveler series is one exception to that, especially the Doomsday Book, which directly takes on the Black Death, the Middle Ages, via time travel. But we're kind of getting into, in your books, like this mash up of all these different elements, some of which are coded as science fiction, some of which are coded as fantasy, some of which are coded as historical fiction, and you're mashing them all together. So science fantasy is something that we like a lot. Obviously, we like your books for that reason, along with many others, but I don't know that I'm even going to come to like a question here. I just kind of like want to toss the science fantasy ball back at you and hear what you have to say about it.
That's a very big ball.
Yeah, totally.
Well, the day the binary between fantasy and science fiction broke down for me was the day I finally kind of realized that faster than light travel would never, ever actually happen.
Yeah.
A lot of science fiction starships are presented as something that might actually happen one day, but in real life they might as well be powered by wizards and unicorn horns, for as realistic as they are. I do want to briefly shout out Space Unicorn Blues by T.J. Barrie, in which faster than light travel actually is powered by unicorn horns.
Which is amazing.
It's such a weird book, but I mean, yeah, brilliant.
So these aren't plausible futures in the way that science fiction is sometimes often presented as, hey, this could be a plausible future. Mm-hmm. Hard science fiction especially is more of an affectation or an attitude than a fact, I think.
Sorry, we have been debating over, quote unquote hard science fiction for years here on the podcast. We're tortured over the use of this term. So it's nice to hear you say that so neatly and like bind up all of our feelings in one sentence.
Yeah. Well, hard science fiction is just a way the authors want to make you feel. Yeah. It's it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual plausibility of whatever they're presenting. It's just a way they want you to feel as though this could happen. And there are a number of tricks and things that are elided in that. Like that famous short story, The Cold Equations, goes to a lot of lengths to sell you on the feeling of there being a cold, uncaring universe, even though it's wildly unrealistic in a lot of other ways. Like security or workplace safety and management and terrible engineering. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I do think the genre definitions are important and meaningful. For that reason, fantasy and science fiction are affectations. They're things that people want you to feel. Their moods and their expectations and their sets of tropes. They're useful as marketing terms too, and I don't say that to demean them. A reader's expectations are important to manage and shape their overall experience, and the process by which their expectations are shaped is an art by itself. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been, like I said, it's been clear for ages now that we're never going to have a future with interstellar civilizations that in any way resemble our own, but those fantasies are still sold as science fiction, and it's just so are staples like Star Trek, and explicitly magical science fiction, science fantasies like Star Wars are sold as science fiction more often than our fantasy, and that's just fine. What they're setting up their expectations and setting up the way that they want you to feel and setting up the tropes that you might expect them to use.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to look with a very careful eye at any science fiction that does try to present itself as a plausible future, because it is going to have to be doing a lot of things differently than most science fiction does.
Yeah. And kind of picking up the thread from earlier in the podcast where we talked about, how systems of government and, not only the systems themselves, but the intricacies of like how people work within them and, the social orders that support them are going to be so unknowable outside of our particular context, outside of the context that makes them meaningful. Like, it makes me think of something like Solaris, which is very weird and very strange, but also feels very real in a way that a lot of, like, doing air quotes here, hard science fiction doesn't necessarily seem, because it's trying to nail down, like, our current understanding and project it out into the future, whereas, a work like Solaris is very much like, what the hell is this? We just kind of have to, like, look at it and describe what we're seeing and maybe get at something that way. And that seems, in a lot of ways more real to what an experience like that would be like.
And I was just going to jump in, and I think this kind of carries on a little bit from what you were saying, that like the best quote unquote plausible science fiction or fantasy, it's plausible in its human dynamics just as much as it's plausible in like the technologies and so forth that it presents. I'm thinking here, again, like, just I guess because he's on our mind a lot, but like Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, it is simultaneously presenting us with near future technologies in terms of like the generation starship. It doesn't have faster than light travel and so on and so forth, and it tries to actually plot orbital trajectories, and it talks about like what would the effects be on the human microbiome if we encountered something like a truly foreign stellar body and things like that. But it's parsed out, it's given to us by way of a conversation between two characters, a human character and the ship's AI, and it's the relationship that sells you on the plausibility. It's not the technology, and it's never the technology. I mean, and I think too of like Ursula K. Le Guin and all of Le Guin's work. Like, you bought Le Guin not because of like the technologies, whether they were plausible or not at all, and Le Guin really wrote the whole spectrum there, but you bought Le Guin because of the relationships between the characters and what that revealed about the nature of humanity and our shared future. I think that kind of converses with what you were saying, Tony, and what you have been saying all along, Tristan.
Yeah.
Expanding my reading list. Can I send you a bill?
I mean, you can kind of go Dutch, because I am getting, some reading list material from you as well with the Mirror book, so I'm looking forward to that. But kind of to like pull us into the downward ski slope of this podcast. So we wanted to not just talk about like these forces that are present in your texts and like they're shaping your work, but like what do we do next? Like collectively as readers and writers and creators and listeners and enthusiasts of science fiction and fantasy, like how do we break down some of the like problematic approaches to colonialism, feudalism, genre, like we've been talking about, like maybe a false binary between science fiction and fantasy. Like what are some next steps that we can be working on?
Well, kind of starting with something I briefly brought up earlier, is that I'd love to see the effects of contact and exploration and study rather than colonization. Mm-hmm. Like New World crops and animals had a civilization-shaking effect on the Old World and vice versa. The vast majority of people on any continent remained where they were, but their lives were changed regardless just by a very minimal number of well, I shouldn't say, but it was never very minimal, but it could have been it could have been changed dramatically by a very minimal amount of contact. Like, what if there was a station on a moon like Titan that discovered extraterrestrial life? What if that life, or some modified version of it, could come here? What other fantastic ways could life change with the arrival of life that we would have difficulty conceptualizing, like in the Southern Reach trilogy, but hopefully not as horrifying.
Right.
Absolutely. So Tony, did you have any kind of final questions or thoughts on this whole like future, sort of future building in science fiction and fantasy?
I just would like to say that we have covered so much ground here, and I am very thankful, very appreciative of Tristan being with us and everything that you managed to talk about today, because I am so impressed and in awe of the places that you took us, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on. This has been wonderful.
Oh, good. Yeah, not just like where you took us in the podcast, but your books as well. So, quick plug for those of our listeners who haven't yet pulled out their Goodreads app and thrown Quietus and Terminus on their to-read list. These are books that are doing some really interesting and unusual things that are really breaking some ground. And I think, I was kind of posing this question of like, where do we go from here? But, Quietus and Terminus may actually be like the where do we go from here? They might provide us with some thoughts on that. So we hope that you will check out those books. And as we kind of exit from the podcast, Tristan, where can people find out more about your work and what's next?
For you.
There are going to be some things next. Several exciting things. Unfortunately, tragically, I am under NDA for a lot of them, so I can't talk about them yet. But the best place to keep an eye on things as they appear is either on my website or on my Twitter. My website is just tristanpalmgren.com, and my Twitter is very creatively at Tristan Palmgren.
Delightful. Thank you so much. And did you have any final thoughts or comments as we exit the podcast today?
Just my immense gratitude for you having me on. Thank you.
We have loved every minute of it. And thank you for rolling with our most awkward and weirdest moments here on the podcast, of which there have been many.
Yes.
So, Tony, where can you find out more about the podcast?
So you can find out more about the podcast behind you. No, I'm just kidding. So you can go to Imaginaries.net, which is our website. We are now, again, across all of your podcasting platforms for your pleasure. We are on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, back episodes on YouTube, and then nearly every podcast app. If you have a different app on your phone that you prefer, they'll probably feed from one of those sources, so you can find us in all places under the Imaginaries podcast. And you can always talk to us on Twitter at imaginary_pod, or send us an email at imaginarypod@gmail.com.
We are so grateful to Tristan for giving us his time. This has been an epic podcast. This has been quite lengthy, and that's quite a commitment, that you have given us. So we are grateful for your time as well as your thought.
Quite.
And on that note, bye.
Yeah, bye.
Goodbye.
3, 2, 1.